To order. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak on items not on the agenda? Seeing none, we will move to the first agenda item. Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Finance Director, and we will start with the investment report, which will then be followed by discussion of the budget for next year.
Thank you.
I want to turn it over to Ms. Jill Tara, our Treasury Manager.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, Chair Francisco and committee members. I'm Jill Tara, Treasury Manager, and I'm here with the quarterly investment report and fiscal agent report for the date ended March 31st, 2011. As you know, I come to you each quarter and bring a synopsis of key economic events during the quarter. We look at national measures including financial market results, federal bank activity, CPI, unemployment, and Treasury yields, because all of these affect how much we can earn on our surplus cash that we have invested. When we make daily investment decisions, we first ensure the safety of an investment that we are considering. We look at the city's current liquidity needs over the coming months, and after we've looked at those two measures of safety and liquidity, then do we turn to yield, and in evaluating a particular investment that we might be considering, look to see whether it's a fair rate of return based on current market conditions. So that's why we come to you each month with this. With respect to the economy, 2011 is off to a good start after showing signs of stabilizing last year. Again, this quarter, financial markets showed strong growth as both consumer and business spending increased, and we saw lower unemployment nationally. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, the S&P 500, and NASDAQ financial markets all posted gains of 5 to 6% over the quarter, so that was good news. The Federal Reserve Open Market Committee at its March meeting gave its most optimistic assessment of the economy since the recession ended, indicating, quote, the firmer footing of the economy. However, there was discussion at the March meeting about the potential for future inflation, and that's given that energy prices have risen 15.5% over the last 12 months, and we're seeing that those energy price increases are being passed through to consumers in the form of higher prices. So while there is a potential for future inflation, the committee decided to keep the Fed funds rate at the historic low range of 0 to 0.25%. And I'm not sure whether you're aware, we don't talk about this, but it's been at that historic low since December 2008 and hasn't moved. And although the committee didn't indicate this time, future reports out from the minutes indicated that it would stay at exceptionally low levels for a long period of time. So, at the March meeting, the committee also discussed the quantitative easing strategy announced last November. You'll hear it referred to as QE2. That's where there's the planned purchase of $600 billion in treasuries planned through June of this year. And the committee unanimously agreed to continue it, to continue this monetary policy tool to keep interest rates low, spur growth in the economy, and hopefully return inflation to target levels, which are 1.5% to 2%. At the 12 months ended March 31st, CPI was up 0.5%, so that's lower than the Fed fund target rate. However, 3/4 of the increase in the CPI at the end of March was due to large increases in the gasoline and food sectors alone. So you can see what's causing the inflation and the potential for that to continue if no further Fed action happens. So I'd like to move on to the Treasury yield table. This is also shown in page 2.
I have a question. QE2, the quantitative easing, isn't that also coupled with printing money?
Yes, they print money to buy the treasuries, which then increases the money supply and makes more money available for loans and spending in the economy.
Now, historically, hasn't that also been an inflationary, the result of printing more money results
it can
in the devaluation of our dollar and the inflation to the consumer?
You're right. committee member Self, it can have that effect, but right now, especially through the end of calendar year 2010, you'll recall last quarter when I was here, there were real fears of deflation, and so they rolled out this program in the last quarter of 2010 to sort of stave off deflation and stimulate the economy and get inflation back where they think it should be. So it's still lower than it should be, but we now have other factors affecting inflation, namely the crunch in the oil supply, as well as food prices and agricultural costs increasing. So it's a fine line, and yes, it can have that result if it's not applied correctly.
Thank you.
But the Fed watches that closely every meeting. Okay. On the overhead, this table is also on page 2 of the agenda report for this item. And you can see that Treasury yields increased over the quarter. The far right-hand side, it shows the cumulative change.
Nothing to nothing.
Investments in financial markets remain strong due to the improving economy. This reduced the demand for treasuries, thereby lowering the prices. And when the treasury prices go down, the yield in a corresponding amount goes up. You can see highlighted there is the one-year treasury note. That remained basically flat over the quarter, growing just up only 1 basis point. The 5-year increased modestly by 27 basis points, and you can also see nice increases in the 3 to 4 year range of the Treasury notes. And that 3 to 4 year range is really what we target in looking at buying non-callable securities into our market. So we were happy to see a slight flattening, very, very slight flattening in the outer end of the Treasury yield curve. Down at the bottom is the LAIF rate, and although it's dark, I'll read it across for you. At the end of December, the LAIF rate had dropped to a historic low, or historic low at least since we've been tracking it for many, many years. It dropped below 0.5% to 46 basis points. And you'll recall LAIF is the State of California Pooled Investment Fund. That's our money market account, and we can earn a much better rate by sending our surplus cash each day up to LAIF and pulling it down by 10 a.m. the next morning should we need it to cover the city operations. So we were happy to see that the LAIF quarterly apportionment rate over the first quarter of 2011 bumped back up over 0.5% to 0.51. At the end of March, we had $30 million in city LAIF funds, or in city funds up at LAIF, and another $15 million in the RDA LAIF account for a total of 40.5. Today, we have, because of purchases that have occurred since the quarter end, we have $20 million in city funds up at LAIF, and still the 15 that we hold up there as a minimum amount for RDA. On to the next slide. We'll turn to the city's investment activity over the quarter. You can see the top section shows the purchases that we made. We made $19 million in purchases, and then down below we had a total of $16 million in calls and maturities over the quarter for net investment activity of $3 million. We purchased in a combination of both callables to replace the called securities during the quarter, and also began looking more closely and purchasing bullets, as we're seeing some of our callable securities are not being called as interest rates turn around. And so we've really tried to focus on replacing bullets. And you'll recall a bullet is a federal agency that will be held to maturity, whereas a callable agency has a specific potential call schedule that the issuer, be it Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHLB, can say, we exercise that call right, and they'll call it away early. In exchange for that risk of not knowing exactly how long you will be able to hold callable securities in your portfolio, you generally earn anywhere from 18 to 25 basis points over the bullets for the period. So you can see, in addition to the federal agencies that we purchased, we try and diversify within the options, including Freddie Mac's, Fannie Mae's, Federal Home Loan Banks, and Federal Farm Credits. We also bought one corporate. That's the second listing under the purchases category, and we replaced a GECC corporate note, and you'll see down the last listing in the maturities we had one matured during the quarter back in February. What's interesting is I'd like to point you to the last column, the yield to maturity. And the weighted average yield to maturity for the purchases that we purchased over the quarter was 1.966%. That's compared to 3.825% on the calls and maturities, really reflecting this continuing low rate environment. I'll go on to the next slide. This is our benchmark yield table. The top red line shows the return on our overall investment portfolio. The second line down, which is purple and you can't see very well, is the LAIF rate. The third line, the green line, is the 2-year Treasury, and the very bottom line is the 90-day T-bill. And I'll just focus on the March quarter results. At the end of March, our portfolio yield declined to 15.3 basis points from 2.075% at the end of December down to 1.922%. I don't know when it's been that low, but it's certainly, as you can see, outperforming the other benchmarks that we measure ourselves against. And I would like to mention to the committee that while we look good now and our yield has certainly stayed well above the other benchmarks, as the market turns to more normal levels and yields turn around, we'll see the LAIF rate turn around more quickly than our portfolio. It's a shorter portfolio, as well as the Treasury note respond more quickly. So at some point we could see that switch until the holdings that we have in our portfolio mature, and then we're able to buy back in at higher interest rates. So for now, we've held steady, but typically, as I mentioned, I believe last quarter, our portfolio yield really hovers within about 1% of the LAIF rate. So that's our typical average. I'd like to turn and look at the investment income that we earned on the portfolio holdings over the quarter. You can see the total on the pooled investments, which is the surplus cash from all the funds, including all the enterprise funds and the general fund. The total for the quarter was just under $774,000. Interest on the cash held up at LAIF for the RDA, that's $15 million, the interest was $18.2 thousand, and the total interest for the quarter was $792,257. For comparison, if you look back at March 2008, you can see here in March of 2011, we earned $260,000, and in March 2008, the portfolio interest for that particular month was $643,000. So the low interest rate environment has certainly affected, returns and being able to use that to use the interest on the surplus funds for programs and services. And I'd like to conclude the report today with a snapshot of the portfolio balances at the end of March. As mentioned before, you can see the funds held up at LAIF total $40.5 million. That's $30 million in city funds and $15 in RDA funds. We held one certificate of deposit in the portfolio of $2 million held with a CD at Montecito Bank and Trust. Our federal agency issues, diversified within the 4 issuers, totaled over $110 million. And we held just under $6 million in corporate notes. And the medium-term notes are those notes with a maturity of 5 years or less. The remaining outstanding principal balance on the 20-year airport promissory note that we purchased into the city's investment portfolio with council approval is just over $6 million. And at the end of March, we had $4.7 million in our operating bank account at Santa Barbara Banking Trust to cover outstanding payables and payroll checks that hadn't cleared the bank. Total cash and investments at the end of March totaled just over $169 million. So with that concludes my report. And I would like to mention that attachment 2 in your council agenda or your finance committee agenda report includes a listing of the funds held at fiscal agents. And they are a combination of bond reserve funds, bond project funds, as well as the funds for the Police and Fire Service Commission pension funds. So the total held with fiscal agents at the end of March was at book value $40.8 million.
Thank you, Ms. Tara.
Great.
Any questions from committee members? I guess not. So we need a motion on this to
To forward to
accept
council?
and recommend to council.
So move.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, next item.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we are on to the review of the fiscal year 2012 recommended budget. And this is really the first meeting of Finance Committee where we get into the details of the recommended budget. And we're going to be looking at things that the City Council won't be looking at least not to this level of detail. And today we have 3 items we're going to cover. We're going to actually review with you the balancing strategy we'll be using for next year related to the general fund. And then Ms. Tara will speak again, but she'll be focusing on revenues of this year, but really how they based our assumptions for next year. Excuse me. And then lastly, we'll talk about position changes citywide, and that was something that I think the committee wanted to look at. And when we get into that, you'll see just a real summary of those. I don't have too much details. I can give you a broad sort of sense of what those changes are about. And the idea was that if there was any interest on the committee's part to look at more detail of any of those changes, we can come back with the appropriate department and we'll explain all the details you want. So with that, we'll start with the balancing strategy. And this is really similar to or almost exactly what we presented to the City Council, but just to kind of give you a chance to weigh in and look at more details. So in balancing, the key objectives were, as you know, to avoid the use of general fund reserves. Our goal, obviously, is to either keep them the same or restore them wherever possible. We also wanted to avoid further cuts to staffing and services. We felt that there have been substantial cuts in some departments more than others, but substantial cuts to services and staffing, and we wanted to minimize that or avoid that in this coming year. And then there were some areas that we wanted to restore or expand, and that had to do with youth, gang violence, transient population, and library hours. We've talked about those areas. But here's how we balanced, and this time I've shown you 2013 because that's part of the 2-year financial plan. But let's start with the 2012. Originally identified budget gap, and that's a moving target, as you know. It was about 2.9 back in December. It moved a little bit and went down by the time we put together the budget document to $2.7 million. How we propose to balance against that projected deficit. All one-time measures, important to note. The assumed wage and benefit concessions of $1.8 million, roughly 6% across all those non-safety labor groups. That's managers, supervisors, and SEIU employees. The other one-time measures, and I'll get into more detail, but this is the shift of the LUF program reserves and then using some underground or utility undergrounding fund reserves and then the rebate of the self-insurance fund reserves. And I'll just spend a little more time on each of these. We have a program that to respond to fuel tanks, underground fuel tanks that we discover oftentimes by chance when there's a project being worked on and we have to do some work in the public right of way, and we come across these tanks that have been there for many, many years. Sometimes we can attribute or assign responsibility to a private party or to somebody else, and we will get recovery. But most of the time, we have to just pay for it ourselves, and it involves removing the tank, remediating any contaminated soil, and monitoring it. And so that's a program we've had for a while, but we've done a pretty good job in addressing the ones that we know about. There could be some in the future. But we did put some money aside in our capital program to address these tanks, and these are monies that are left over in that program, in that capital fund. We don't see anything coming up in the near future, but these are funds that are available currently. It's possible in 2 years, 3 years, we find another tank that we have to address, but for now, we see these monies as being available to us. Kind of hard to read. The $150,000 undergrounding utility program, this was a program whereby we would, really at the request of neighborhoods, we would put all the wiring, electric wiring, utility wiring underground, and it involves putting not only the common areas that go through the street, but also undergrounding those portions that go to the property owners' homes. And Southern California Edison would pay a portion of those for the common areas, but the property owners through an assessment district would have to pay a portion attributable to the lines going to their properties. And these assessment districts are associated with the issuance of bonds of some sort, and that would finance the improvements, and then the property owners would pay back through assessments on their tax bill an amount equal to the debt service requirements. And so we've had a few projects where this has been successful, but as of late, we've not been able to help the property owners. There just hasn't been enough support in some of these areas, even though they showed interest initially. Once they saw, I think, the price tag, they all started getting a little worried and concerned about how much it would cost. So at this point, hasn't been any request of us to move forward with these kinds of projects. So we are taking advantage of monies that are left over in that program of $150,000 to help toward our 2012 general fund problem. We talked about the self-insurance fund. This was a change in the difference between the cash and claims liability. You could see in 2004 we actually had a deficit. It's grown substantially during this period of time. We have rebated to all funds, including the general fund, over $9 million just because of just a better performance, changes in actuarial valuations. About half of that will have gone to the general fund by next year, and the other half to the enterprise funds. We talked about the pension costs. That's one of the challenges we have facing us. Don't need to go into much detail, but other than to say that the rates are going to be going up starting next year particularly. For next year, the rates are rates that we've been told that are firm by PERS. Beyond that, they're just projections by PERS for 2013 and 14. Very unusual that they would give us rates this far in advance, but because of what's going on with the losses being spread over these 3 years from 2009, they felt it was helpful to provide those estimates. 2014 it does include the expiration of the concessions from police and fire, where they're paying a portion currently of their PERS costs, the employee portion, and so that assumes that the city will go back to paying those. But in that same year, of course, we'll be negotiating a new contract with fire and police. The challenges, as Ms. Tara indicated, things are looking better in the financial markets and the economy, but it's still uncertain. And as I've said before, we really need to see revenues grow well beyond what we're seeing, we projected, in order for us to at least close that gap through revenue growth alone. And I want to go back to the fact that when you look at this schedule here, 2013, we have a structural problem of about $2.7 million. 2013 is still unbalanced. We have not identified any solutions. We've left it unbalanced at this point. But you can see we're going to need to come up with some other ways to close that gap. That gap will continue into the future, perhaps get worse, if we don't make any adjustments to ongoing expenditures or we see growth in revenues beyond what we've assumed. So that gap in 2013 does assume some growth in revenues, modest growth based on what we know today. If we do 2 or 3% better than we think on taxes as a whole, that could go a long way to closing that gap, but that's a big if. And then, again, the long-term strategy is really just to contain costs. Hopefully the revenues will outpace those costs, and we're going to have to look to continued concessions at least next year and then or 2013. Once we get into 2014, we'll have to just look once again with how the revenues match up against our costs. So with that, I just wanted to review that and see if there are any questions on that.
Questions? I just have one comment. On the general fund key objectives, obviously it would be nice if we could have avoided using general fund reserves before we went into the recession. That didn't happen. And I think that, again, given the economic uncertainty in front of us, it still makes sense to avoid using them if we can. On the other hand, this is exactly the sort of economic period during which it was assumed that those reserves might be necessary. So, and then also on the bullet item of avoiding further cuts to staffing and services, of course, I want to do that to the extent possible, but we may need, as a council, based on the priorities we perceive, to do some rebalancing that might result in cuts in some places and additions elsewhere.
Right.
Okay.
Good. Okay, with that, we'll look at the revenues. I'm going to switch back over to the document reader.
Jill Tara, Treasury Manager. I've passed out to each of the committee members a packet containing the overheads, and I've also placed by the door copies for members of the public who are here. I'd like to start by looking at non-departmental revenues by category to sort of give the context of where we are. You can see that our total non-departmental revenues in fiscal year 2010 ended about $74,000. And when we were working on the $74 million. When we were working on the budget for the current fiscal year, we saw huge revenue declines continuing and not knowing when our revenues were going to turn around, and actually budgeted a decline. You can see the change at the bottom of $3.16 million. Now, ordinarily, we would see revenues growing that would help offset cost increases that we see within our organization. So last year, when we were looking down the pipe of an $8.9 million problem, part of the problem was that, a big part of the problem was that our revenues were declining in a period with cost increases. Now, the good news is that as we've weathered the storm through fiscal year 11, you can see that we're projected to end the year about $2.2 million better than what we adopted. So that's good news. We'll still be 1.3% below where we were in fiscal year 10 overall in the non-departmental category, and we have been able to, based on turnarounds in some of our key revenues, look and forecast out for the next 2 years a 2.5% increase for 2012 and a 1.6% increase in non-departmental revenues for 2013. Now, the biggest category of our non-departmental revenues is obviously taxes, and that's the first line shown there. Taxes totaled at the end of fiscal year 2010 on an actual basis $60.8 million. The adopted budget showed a 1.5% decline down to 15.9. However, we've had almost a 3% swing throughout the year in our tax revenues, and they're projected to end the year about $61.8 million with, again, modest growth budgeted next year. But I wanted to give you the big picture to show that the $2.7 million problem that we're grappling with, at least for 2012, some of that was offset by the $1.8 million revenue increase. So were it not for our revenues to at least have recovered somewhat modestly, our problem would be much bigger. We'll go on to our next slide and talk about some of the key non-departmental revenues, both tax and non-tax non-departmental revenues, in a little bit more detail. The way the schedule works is down the left are the different revenue sources. We have sales tax, property tax, and TOT being the three largest, property tax in number one spot. These are key tax revenues and make up the bulk of the funding for the general fund. Down below the line are UUT, franchise fees, business license, property transfer tax, the interest that we earn on our portfolio, and motor vehicle license fees. And I'll cover the top three in a little bit more detail because they are the largest. So I'd like to drop down below that bold line and go through the others first before we look at the key taxes in detail. At the end of fiscal year 2010, we ended the UUT at $7 million and budgeted only a slight increase. We were seeing declines in both the gas and electric sectors, offset somewhat by increases in telephone and water and refuse. But as you know, and as I've spoken to the committee before about, this tends to be a very volatile revenue because the bulk of it, the two largest sources of UUT are gas and electric, and those commodity prices just can be outside of our control and highly variable. So we budgeted basically flat at $7 million. We think we'll do slightly better than budget and come in at $7.05 million. What we've budgeted for next year, as we've seen gas and electric turn around and show healthy growth, we've budgeted overall for UUT a 1.2% growth next year, leaving the revenue budget for UUT at $7.14 million. Next on to franchise fees. Franchise fees are about a $3 million revenue for our general fund, and that are fees paid to the city from the utility providers who use our public rights-of-way in the course of providing their businesses. That includes the electric company, gas, the refuse haulers, and also the cable company. Revenues came in at the end of fiscal year 10 at $3.35 million, and we budgeted a decline of 2.5% for this year, seeing substantial declines in the gas franchise fees that they pay us. However, once they did the cleanup midway through fiscal year 11, the commodity price had increased and had really helped turn around that particular revenue. So we think we'll end the year about $3.5 million, which is up 4% over the prior year. We've budgeted franchise fees at a 3% growth next year for 2012 at almost $3.6 million, and that represents, it is very close to our average growth in that franchise fee. Business license are approximately a $2 million revenue source for our city and are issued to businesses doing business or coming into the city to do business. We've seen these decline throughout the recession years, and in fact we budgeted a 3.4% decline for the adopted budget this year. We're seeing it come in slightly better, which is good news, which means that our local businesses have weathered the economy better than we had once thought. Next year, we're budgeting roughly flat with how we think we'll end the year this year, up 0.6% at, again, $2.2 million. Dropping down to property transfer tax, this is the tax that is assessed when properties change hands, and we receive a portion of that. Typically, it's in the $300,000 to $400,000 range. We're glad to see it trending upwards. That means there are home sales occurring and at greater amounts of land turning over than we had seen immediately after the housing bubble. So we budgeted down 7.9% for fiscal year 11. We think we'll end the year just over $405,000 and estimating about $410,000 for next year. For portfolio interest, this is the general funds piece of the interest earned on the portfolio. You just received the investment report. So this is, once we take that investment as that interest as reported in the report, we allocate it between all of the various city funds based on their average cash balances. So this represents the general fund share. And this revenue at one time was well over $1 million, and we've seen it decline, and, you know, at some point it will come back up, but certainly not through 2012 or 2013. The 2010 actual portfolio interest to the general fund was about $826,000. We dropped it for the adopted budget this year to $615,000, analyzing cash balances, what we thought the reinvestment rate would be, as well as the LAIF, an assumption of our LAIF balance and the LAIF rate. What's happened is the market's declined far lower than we even thought. October of 2010, the 5-year Treasury note hit 1.17, which was lower than it had ever been since it had come into existence. So we think we'll end the year about $572,000, and we believe that the yield on the overall portfolio will decline a little bit next year, down 11.8% to just right around $500,000. The final major non-departmental revenue I'd like to cover is VLF. That's the Vehicle Motor License Fee that we receive from the state. It used to be much larger, but back in 2005, the state took a big piece of our VLF and traded it and gave us a corresponding amount of property tax, which wrapped into our property tax. So what was left for us in terms that was dispersed to us as motor vehicle license fee was a small amount, and what we've seen over the years is that we'll have an amount that is attributable to our local agency. However, the admin fees that are layered on by the state in many months actually exceed the amount of our disbursements, so there'll be some months where we don't even get anything. We budget this particular revenue very conservatively. We ended the year at the end of fiscal year 10 at $276,000. We dropped it this year because that last quarter we were very unsure whether we would get anything in the remaining quarter. As it's coming in this year, we think we'll hit $200,000, and we just kept it flat for next year. And we'll go into a little bit more detail now on the sales tax, property tax, and transient occupancy tax, or bed tax. The first set of slides will cover where we think we'll end the year, and then we'll go through some historical and look at what we're budgeting for next year. So here's the sales tax table. This is sales tax by calendar quarter as we receive it, and it's accrued to the calendar quarter in which it was received. So if you look over on the year-end estimate for 2011, we've received on an actual basis through the December quarter roughly $9 million in sales tax, and we received that December payment in March. It's received 3 months in arrears. So looking at where we ended the year, you can see we're above where we thought we would be in terms of the adopted budget. The adopted budget assumed an overall decline of 1.6% and was budgeted at $16.4 million, building on a decline of 4.8% from the previous year. We think we've seen it turn around, and are hopeful that in the March and June quarters we'll see growth of 2% and 1% respectively, leading us at the end of the year to a 2% overall growth at $17.1 million. So we do hope that holds. If we go into the next slide, this shows the actual history of sales tax back to 2000. And then down at the bottom in yellow, you can see the year-end estimate of $17.1 million that we just discussed. That's roughly $665,000 above the adopted budget. So that will give us a nice surplus at the end of the year to cover cost overruns in other areas. For the proposed budget for fiscal year 12 as contained in the budget document, we've assumed a 3% growth, which would leave us, or which would result in approximately $17.6 million, and that's a little bit over $500,000 above where we think we'll end this year, and we've assumed 4% growth in the out years. And again, for the second year of the two-year plan, we have made rough estimates, and we'll be coming back to you a year from now as we put together our mid-cycle budget, and we will look at those revenues much more closely. But particularly in this economic environment, it's really quite difficult to speculate how quickly things will turn around. One other thing I wanted to point out on this slide, you can see that the high of our sales tax was in 2007 at $20.2 million. We're looking at $17.6 million for next year. And you look at the blue line up at the top, that puts us roughly in line with the sales tax that we collected 11 years ago, back in fiscal year 2001. So we've lost many years of growth in this, in our second largest sales tax, or second largest non-departmental tax revenue. We'll move on to property tax now. And property tax is one that we have seen strong growth in, but has really been hit with the housing bubble burst, and particularly the decline locally in housing values and the decline in the California CPI. So under Prop 13, the assessed value on the books for purposes of setting property taxes in that first category up there that says property tax, that's the regular property tax assessed roll. And generally, it's raised each year by 2% or CPI, which is less. And we've looked at 2 years of declining CPI, but for 2012, we had a slight positive CPI. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. You can see the year-end estimate total for property tax is $22.8 million. That consists of a decline of 0.4% in just our regular secured and unsecured property tax of $22.5 million. Airplane property tax seems to be coming in at the budget amount, which is down about 6.5% at $515,000. Interest, has dropped. This is interest that the county pays us while they're holding our property tax fund until the disbursement date. And our supplemental, we believe we're on target to hit $300,000 this year, which was our budget, and is certainly up from what we collected last year, which was only $244,000. The last thing I would like to note is you can see that we've seen substantial increases in the county property tax admin fees. that are basically told to us. We're working with the county right now to understand why in fiscal year 9 we had a 32.9% increase, in 2010 a 3.2% increase, and then again back for this year the 28.2% increase. So anyway, based on our year-end estimate, that will end us down 0.9, roughly down 1% again this year. And for next year, we've assumed a 1% growth in the secured and unsecured property tax and the county admin fees. And because it is our largest revenue, we felt it prudent to leave the airplane interest and supplemental taxes flat for both years. In the out year in 13, we've bumped that growth assumption to 1.5%.
Question.
Sure, Mr. White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you clarify what supplemental means?
Yeah, supplemental property tax is like a property transfer tax. It's levied at the time a sales transaction takes place. And we collect supplemental when the house sells for a higher value than it's listed on the books. So it brings the property value to the books, and therefore a corresponding amount of property tax is due on that new increased value. And so while we're seeing this stay flat, we have seen the property tax or property transfer tax increase, as I mentioned on the first page. So we're seeing the properties turn over, but they're certainly, at or below what the book value is. So we're not collecting a whole bunch more in supplemental. Does that make sense? Good. Going to the historical property tax table, you can see back to 2001, we have just seen phenomenal growth in property tax over the last decade. In 2001, it was 7.1 and went up from there. You'll notice in 2005, that 43.6% increase corresponds to the VLF swap I mentioned when we went over motor vehicle license fee on the first page. The high of property tax was in 2009, before we had seen the full impact on our local housing market, and that $23.2 million. We think we'll end the year this year at $22.8 million, which is just slightly above the adopted budget. And next year, the assumed growth of 1% will put us at $23 million. I'd like to finish the discussion today going over transient occupancy tax, and I know you're all well versed in this. I send out monthly updates because this particular tax is the closest thing that we have to a leading indicator. We get it so quickly after the close of the month. From 1 month's sales, the tax is due to us on the 10th of the following month, and so we're really able to have a sense of how many visitors, both business and pleasure, travelers were getting to the region and how many are staying in hotels. Of course, usually the sales tax trends in the same direction as the TOT, so it's helpful to know this. The adopted budget for the current fiscal year assumed flat from where we thought we would end fiscal year 10. As it turned out, fiscal year 10 came in a little bit better, so we could actually end the year at our budget of $11.1 million and decline 2.7% and still meet our budget. However, we've really seen strong recovery, as you know, in this tax this year. And although March's results were very disappointing at the 0.2% growth, some of that impact is due to spring breaks and Easter. We also had some poor weather. We didn't feel it was necessary at this point to change our year-end forecast. We think that it's possible to meet 5% overall growth for the remaining quarter, although our biggest challenge will be in June when bed tax collections are over $1 million for the month, and we're building on a 12.1. So our year-end estimate is roughly $12.3 million, which would give us overall growth of $7.2 million. Going on to the budget years, you can see the history. This has also been a strong performer. Back to 2001, it was at $10 million and 8.3% growth. The high was in 2008 with $12.9 million collected in that year. Again, we expect to end this year at $12.2 million, which is actually $1.1 million above our adopted budget, which can be used to cover shortfalls and other cost overruns during the areas and shortfalls in any departmental revenues. For 2012, we've proposed a 4.5% growth in the revenue, which would put us to $12.8 million and put us back to collections. In the blue bar you can see above, roughly at collections in 2007. For 2013, we've assumed a 5% growth for now, and that would bring in $13.5 million. And that concludes my presentation on some of the key non-departmental revenues, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Tara. Any questions from committee members? No questions.
If I could just point out that
Oh,
for sales, go ahead, you start.
In the total TOT, is that include the 2% that goes to our Creeks division, or is that without that?
No, these are just, I'm sorry, Committee Member Self, this is just the general funds portion, so this is the 10%. There's an
Okay.
additional 2% receipted directly in the Creeks Fund, and you'll hear about their revenue estimates in terms of what that means in dollars when you have the Creeks presentation, but their assumptions are the same as we've used in the general fund. And that's the same with Streets UUT. The UUT under the code is split 50-50 between the general fund and the Streets Fund, and we use the same assumptions citywide to come up with those revenue estimates.
Thank you.
Just a final comment, kind of tying it back to our strategy. The estimates for sales tax for next year in 2013 are 3% and 4%, which is a pretty moderate growth. For bed tax, 4.5% next year, then 5%. So we're not assuming too conservatively. I think we're being pretty moderate. I don't want to say aggressive, but we're certainly not being too conservative. So in order for us to help really close that gap, we'd have to be seeing growth beyond that, which is in the 5-6% range, which is pretty strong. So
Mr. Samario, do you have a question about that? I know you've been, and your department has been doing this for many, many years, but are those growth projections, how did you come up with those?
Yeah, and I'm going to just maybe have Ms. Tara jump in, but we look at trends mostly. We look at the data history. We look at data that we have from in the sales tax, just general economic news, information we get from our consultants on the sales tax side. They give us some projections that go out a year or two. And again, it's just based on a combination of those factors for sales tax. Bed tax, it's basically more based on current information of this year, and just wanting not to be too conservative, but trying to be realistic about what those growth assumptions are. To give some perspective, since 2002, our growth in these two areas have been somewhere around 5 to 6%. Bed tax a little higher than that. Prior to that, our sales tax was going about 6%. So it's 4%, 5% range, I think, is a realistic assumption. But I don't see us going much beyond that in the next few years, just because the economy is recovering slowly, and I think these are reasonable assumptions. But
Okay, thank you.
yeah. Okay, so we're going to move on to the positions. And the first thing I want to note is, if you look at, I know you don't have it in front of you, but in the budget document, we have a schedule that's 2 pages in length, front to back, and the one schedule shows a summary by department and by fund of the total positions over time, over the last several years. Behind that then is a summary of the position changes, but it's not by fund, it's just listed by department, so it crosses multiple funds, and it's a citywide number. And in that schedule shows a reduction of almost 10 full-time equivalent positions. This year, I'm going to go through it by fund, so it gives you a little more context and perspective, and then by department. And again, as indicated at the outset, I'm going to go through these real briefly, and if it piques your interest and you want to see more details, we can certainly come back to you. That was the plan. It wasn't intended to go into a lot of detail today. So starting with the general fund in the city administrator's office, Ms. Christy Schmidt, the labor relations manager, she was chipping in, helping out in the solid waste fund. She spent half of her time to manage that operation before we had the position filled. It's now filled with Mr. Matt Four, and so her services are no longer needed. However, we are going to still be charging part of her time, 20%, just on an allocated cost basis for her assistance with the negotiations of the contract for Zone 1. So half of her time was allocated to solid waste. We're bringing it back down to the city administrator's office. In the fire department, this is actually relates to just some technical changes to our position resolution. This was a reorganization that occurred back in fiscal year 2009, and now they're just cleaning up the position titles. So there's really no effective or real change or substantive changes to their operations or to their positions. In the library, a few changes. One is the increasing of a library adult literacy coordinator from 0.75 to 0.8, and my understanding in talking with their staff, and as you know, Ms. Macias is on jury duty, so hard to get hold of her, but this increase is to help support fundraising efforts in the library. You'll see that they're moving a custodian and a senior custodian to the Public Works Facilities Division. It's an ICS fund, and that's part of a centralization of that function. The library had its own custodians, and we're moving them over to Public Works facilities maintenance, and they'll centralize those services citywide. And then lastly is the elimination of a vacant library assistant 1 position, and this is to offset the county and state funding reductions that are projected for next year. As you know, the state's going to be reducing funding, and so is the county, to a material amount. So this is just to help balance next year. In Parks and Recreation, the first one is the elimination of a vacant administrative specialist 1. That position has been vacant since 2010, August of 2010. That was part of their fiscal year 2011 budget cuts. The position, the person didn't leave until August. So now we're just cleaning up the resolution to eliminate that position in our resolution. They're also proposing to eliminate a vacant recreation program leader position. It's 0.8 currently, and that relates to the shift of the junior high after-school program to PAL. And they are also proposing to increase a recreation specialist from half-time to 0.8, and this is still to provide support to the RAP. These are after-school programs, RAP and AOK. And in the police department, the first position is the deletion of a vacant police records management, similar to the one I mentioned just a moment ago. A position person left in October 2010. That was part of their current year cuts. We didn't delete the position because they weren't leaving until October, but the savings were realized this year, and now we're just cleaning up the resolution to remove that position. The next two relate to a reclassification and sort of a mini reorganization. The police department lost a crime analyst position, and the records technician was doing a lot of work beyond their classification, and so they're reclassifying the position from a records technician to a police records specialist, and they'll be doing a lot of data analysis related to crimes and supporting the department based on the loss of the crime analyst position. Another reclassification is converting a police safety dispatcher 3 to a public safety dispatch supervisor, and this is to provide more supervisory support and training to that operation. They have about 8 dispatchers, and this will bring the supervisor level to 4, and it's to really provide better oversight and overall less turnover in that operation. And so it's just a better way to do business, and at least that's how they're proposing it. And I have Mr. Mannix, or Deputy Chief Mannix, here if you want to get more details on that that reclassification.
I do.
Okay.
Thank you. Couple of questions. First, on the reclassification on the records position.
Yes.
That was a records technician gone and turned into a police records specialist. Is that correct?
Actually, it's just the opposite.
It's the other way around. Okay.
We are currently filled with a record specialist, and that person was doing more crime data research rather than data entry. So we reclassified that position into a police records technician.
Okay. All right. Very good. On the change in dispatch, I can't remember who it was now, but I remember that there was a sworn officer who was managing that group. So is this replacing that sworn with promoting someone up from dispatch?
No, we still have a sworn lieutenant as the dispatch manager. The theory behind creating a dispatch supervisor out of a dispatch line level personnel is our dispatch supervisors are kind of unique because we task them to do line level work in addition to their supervisory work. So the dispatch supervisor is answering the 911 calls for service, dispatching officers, in addition to all their supervisory responsibilities of writing evaluations, scheduling, administrative work, discipline, and training. So in an effort to make that job assignment a little more equitable, we're increasing the staffing size of our supervisor strength so that we can get some of the positive things that supervisors bring to the line levels, like training and oversight. And we're trying to increase that area so that our new recruits are better trained. We have a softer landing in the dispatch center rather than that very hard, tough, on-the-job training. They get a little more supervision from the greater supervisor pool, and therefore will increase the overall retention rate for our new hires.
So how many dispatch supervisors will there be now?
4.
Okay.
Presently, we have 3. Traditionally, we have had 4 in the past. It's just that when one left several years ago, we left that position vacant, and at that time, we transitioned down to the dispatcher line level, and now we're transitioning it back up. We think we'll be well served with that.
Okay. And what does the after the training and scheduling and the rest of these activities are done, what does the lieutenant who's managing these supervisors, presumably, what are his responsibilities?
He has oversight for the overall operations of the unit, obviously. He is the final say with the scheduling. He also serves as an important liaison between the field officers and the dispatchers when there's concerns about whatever the cases may be. Also, when we get complaints from the public about lack of service or response times, or officer was dispatched too slowly, he's tasked to research the calls to find out whether or not a call was inappropriately held or whether the workload and the call volume was just too busy at any given time. He compiles the monthly CompStat reports for the dispatch center. He has essentially administrative oversight over the unit.
And does he have any other responsibilities?
He's also the Department Public Information Officer.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy Chief. Any other questions? Mrs. Self.
Could that possibly be handled by a non-sworn person?
Yes. Some dispatch units do manage theirs with non-sworn personnel. In years past, we have managed that unit with the non-sworn personnel. There's pros and cons doing it either way. One time when I was at a management school, the manager trainer at that time said one of the most important things that can happen in a dispatch unit is have a close working relationship with the command staff of a department. At that time, it occurred to me that having a police lieutenant down there helps tighten that bond between the line level and working officers in the field, the command staff who are sworn personnel, and the lieutenant, all of whom have a similar background in actual police operations in the field. It helps tighten that bond. It does tend to be a more expensive way of doing business because a police lieutenant, generally speaking, commands a higher income than a non-sworn supervisor. It's difficult to find a non-sworn supervisor who can step in and do that job because of the degree of expertise that you need to function at that level as a manager of a dispatch unit.
So money is the consideration. The pro is that it helps with the bonding, but it would save money to have non-sworn.
It would be a more economical way of supervising that with a non-sworn supervisor. Yes.
Okay, I'll question later about how much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, lastly, in the general fund, we have a new principal civil engineer in the Public Works Department. This is the engineering division, and you see they're adding one position. And this is really to respond to just a growing demand for capital projects, and the engineers, of course, support that. This position will be funded with new revenues, so it's a net zero impact or financial impact to the general fund. And then in total, you can see for the general fund, just under 4 positions will be deleted. Moving on to enterprise funds. We'll start with the solid waste fund, part of the finance department. First item is the deletion of a code enforcement officer. This is part of a reorganization that we're working on, which is going to net us 1 position less in that fund, and that's a code enforcement officer. We are also, as we've talked about before, removing the half-time allocated by Christy Schmidt's time for the management oversight back to the general fund. And then lastly, we are reducing one of our 2 full-time recycling educators from a full-time to part-time, and that's just to respond to revenue declines. We're going to be left with 1.5 recycling educators in that fund.
Mrs. Self has a question?
Don't we have a new manager in this department? Was that an unfilled position that's now filled? Is that how that happened?
Committee member Self, yes, we had a position that was vacant, and we were looking to fill it, and we've now filled it.
Thank you.
In the Community Development Block Grant Fund, it's a federal program. In the Community Development Department, we're proposing to delete a vacant housing loan officer position. The person retired this past year, and we're going to eliminate the position. And I say lack of interest. It was a program where we were providing loans to rehabilitate homes, and there's just been a continuing lack of interest over time. Fewer and fewer loan people coming forward and asking or wanting a loan. So we are proposing to eliminate that program. In the County Library Fund, as we saw in the General Fund, they are moving one of their custodians into the Public Works Facilities Maintenance operation just to centralize that function. And then in the ICS Fund, it's a fund that includes building maintenance, motor pool, and those things. A number of changes. The first 5 relate to that's what I just talked about, the centralization of the custodians. You'll see the 2 custodians brought in from the General Fund, Library Department, and then the 1 senior custodian brought in from the County Library Fund for a total of 3. But that's going to be offset with the elimination of 2.5 vacant custodial positions and elimination of 1 senior custodial position. So these are vacant positions, even though we're moving people over from the library. And the net effect of that is the reduction of 1 custodian position, the net. And it's just part of an overall centralization also we're going to do some of the work by contract, so it's just a more effective way to manage that function. And then you'll see that in the middle, the elimination of a vacant project engineer 2 in the ICS fund, and that's just one of their cost-cutting measures in the building maintenance operation. And the next 2 are related. It's a reclassification. We're deleting a fleet superintendent. That's Mr. Gary Horwall, and he'll be reclassified to a fleet manager given his scope of work and the span of control that he has. He's reporting directly to the Public Works Director, so they felt that reorganization was appropriate, or that reclassification was appropriate. But you'll see in total they're reducing positions in that fund by 2 FTEs. And then lastly, in the water fund, all these changes, actually water and wastewater, are part of a reorganization. The 2 positions in the water fund, you'll see it's a laboratory analyst 2 being reclassified to a laboratory analyst coordinator. That's the same position you'll see down below under the wastewater fund. It's really 1 position that's being reclassified, split between wastewater and water. But all of it really tied to a reorganization that's going to net 0 FTEs, but it's going to just create new positions and eliminate others. A lot of complicated stuff going on there. If you'd like, we can bring that back, but essentially it's just a reorganization in order to more effectively provide those services. On a net basis, it is going to, I believe, going to save money, but on a net basis, no addition or deletion of positions. And I believe that's all I have on the position changes. And again, if there's any area of interest that you wanted to look at in more detail, we can come back at a future Finance Committee meeting with that.
Okay. Any questions from committee members?
Yeah.
Mrs. Self?
Got your pencil ready? not knowing the pay classifications for this and realizing that some left 3 months, 4 months, the time difference, just on an annualized basis for all of these changes, if you could break them out, that'd be wonderful. But, we lost this one at X amount a year, but we replaced him for so-and-so with Y amount of a year.
Sure, we can bring back this same schedule, but showing the annualized cost of these.
Right.
And again, as I mentioned, as you alluded to, we did have some of these positions where we captured the savings this year.
Right.
And they'll continue next year, so we can still bring you.
Yeah,
those
we can
ongoing
just do it
savings.
annualized
Sure,
for each
absolutely.
position to know what that classification
Sure.
is. Thank
No
you.
problem.
Mr. White.
Thank you, Chair. Do you have a sense of the net of the whole series of changes in let's say, 1 in the general fund and then 2 in the enterprise funds? Is it a net increase or decrease? I mean, obviously there's the loss of positions, which is a reduction in cost, but the reorganization side of things.
Yeah, I don't have those dollars again in positions. Citywide is just under 10 positions
Yeah.
that were being eliminated.
Right.
The impact by fund and position, I can bring that back if
As
you
you
like.
said, with Ms. Self's question, that will obviously cover that in total detail.
Thank you.
I see Mr. Kelly here. I wonder if I could ask him a question regarding the new principal engineer.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. So just a very general question here. What will be the duties of this new principal engineer, and what necessitated the creation of this position?
The key function of the new principal engineer will be to support the capital program. You may recall in the last quarterly presentation to council, using our schedule that we have projecting work out for the next 3 years, we anticipate that we're scheduled to complete $95 million worth of capital work next fiscal year, and then $60 million for the 2 following years. Now, that is part of a 3-year projection, and generally schedules have a tendency to slip some, and based on the information we have now, that's how we set up the schedule. So this principal engineer will be to support that program to better assure that we can meet that schedule. And I just had been doing some research of, what does the capital program translate to jobs, and had some interesting information that generally, according to Caltrans, is that it's 18 jobs per $1 million of construction for a transportation project. I can't exactly predict how much this principal engineer will accelerate or reduce the probability of projects being delayed, but it'll have an impact in some manner that we can support jobs in the South Coast.
So just give me a brief summary of what his duties would be.
Okay, in particular, the key projects that we're pressing forward on are the bridges along Mission Creek. So they are complex projects, and a classic example is the Cabrillo Bridge, which has taken a significant amount of time to get going. And the principal engineer, just the nature of right-of-way acquisition, the nature of environmental compliance on the complexity of doing any work within a creek requires a higher level of work, a higher level of knowledge, which is why we're asking for a principal engineer rather than a supervisor or a project engineer. So it would be primarily to press forward on the bridge program.
Okay.
And we have the opportunity to apply for, we just found out that we are eligible to apply for 4 additional bridges on Mission Creek. The bridges on Mission Creek are quite old, actually going up to 100 years. And so you wait long enough and a bridge will become structurally deficient. And so that's what's, we are now eligible for Federal Highway Administration funding, which is at least 88.5% grant funded. And so this new principal engineer will increase the probability of being able to successfully apply and get moving on those projects within the near future.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Oh, Mrs. Self, please.
Follow up on that. Could you give me the pros and cons of going to private engineering firms, either in the city, hopefully, or outside, versus an in-house person?
Sure. Councilmember, is that we found, well, first of all, we'll be hiring professional civil engineers and architects to do the design. And so these will be administration of the contracts. So it's really just having the time to administer the contracts. What we've found is that we could hire a outside consultant to try to manage these, to have a consultant manage a consultant, rather than have our own in-house staff. Our experience in that, and maybe a primary example would be the Granada Garage, is that it's very inefficient to have a consultant manage a consultant. Is that first of all, our billing rate, even though, because we pretty much try to operate as a cost recovery and as a private engineering consulting firm in a sense, but with the focus of the interest of the city. A consultant works for a consulting firm. Their focus is to make a profit. As a professional, they're also working in our interest. But the bottom line is that we found is that the efficiency of staff working together and coordinating is better if it is a city staff member administrating these outside consultant contracts, because they're very specialized for a bridge, as you would know. And it's just more efficient, and also our billing rate is less than a private consulting firm. So it's more efficient.
Thank you.
Anything else, Mr. Samario?
No, I think that's it.
Very good. Meeting adjourned.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.